Thanks. And forgive me, we're kind of going to do the PowerPoint old school, so I'm going to need to shout to change the slides. I didn't bring a clicker or anything. As Miriam said, first of all, thank you for coming. I appreciate having an audience. That's good to have. My name's Eric. I'm from the US originally. I haven't really been back much over the course of the last 6, almost 7 years. And now I'm trying to stay based here in the Canary Islands, at least for the time being. We'll see how that goes. So I guess I'm going to be talking about how to address global conflict with street media. There's a lot of ways to frame what I do and what I've been doing for the past few years, but that's as good a lens to look at it through as any other. So my primary work is something called the Virtual Dinner Guest Project, which sounds weird. There's a reason for the strange name. I will get into that later. But first we can next cover an important topic. Next. So I'm going to try and make this as painless as possible. It's going to be a really short PowerPoint presentation, and I'm more or less going to focus just on a Q&A for people who are curious to know more about at least what I've seen of the Middle East. I can't promise to give you the most objective or unbiased overview, but I'll do the best I can to explain what I've seen and what I've come to know. Next. So if you want to take a minute to relax on the beach and write down my contact info, you can do that now, or you can do that again at the end. All right, next. Okay, so before we start, who can tell me what is the Middle East? What are we referring to when we say Middle East? What region, what countries are we talking about? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Back. Back. No. Other way. Thanks. Well, we kind of blew that one, but does anybody want to take, can you name a country in the Middle East? Sudan. Possibly. Anyone else? We got one country? I think that universally qualifies, Lebanon. So, Palestinian territories. So what would you say is a common feature? If you were going to talk about the Middle East, how are you going to describe it?
It's hot.
Okay, so weather would be one way to describe it. Freedom. Ample amounts of freedom? Question mark. Okay, so freedom? Anything else?
The Arab Spring, speaking of freedom.
Okay, so nested in that term is maybe another identifier. Not spring.
But Arabs being the main population.
Possibly. Or a language group. Arabic tends to be widely spoken language in the region, right? Go ahead. Desert. Okay, that's a very common view of the Middle East. Religion and ideology. Okay, those are things that are also present in the Middle East. Oil in some places. All right, go ahead and let's go next. I won't torture you any longer. Okay, so this is totally subjective, by the way. Just in my quick Google search to steal a picture to put up here, I found at least 5 different takes on what could actually be the Middle East. This is probably one of the more I don't know, you call it geographically liberal presentations of the Middle East, one of the widest. So in some people's view, well, first of all, the term itself, Middle East, that's with reference to where? Who's east, right? If you're in the middle of it, it's not east of you, right? So the origin of this term is kind of a contentious topic to begin with. Some people place it in the mid-1800s, the 19th century with the British Foreign Office in India, of all places. And then again with, I think it was some American naval consultant at the beginning of the 20th century. And then it kind of came, at least in the US perspective, solidified as a political term more around mid-century, I think the 1950s, as being more or less synonymous with what was meant by Near East, which is also subjective and referential to Western countries. So more or less when people describe the Middle East, what they're referring to is North Africa and the western part of Asia, right? That can include all 21, depending on your politics, 21, 22 Arabic-speaking countries. It could include Turkey. Some people decide to include Sudan and Somalia, some people don't. And some people restrict it to really just the Arabian Peninsula and what's called the Levant, which includes Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, etc. So it's a subjective term that's been imposed on the region obviously from outside by colonial interests at a certain point in history. So a traditional term, or a more widely accepted term these days, is MENA, which just means Middle East, North Africa. That's kind of the term in common usage in academic circles, and kind of being adopted by the media, but more slowly. Next. All right, so when we're talking about one of the more contentious regions in the Middle East, it's kind of complicated when it comes to even what to call it, right? So I have these two identical maps, and in one, Palestine's in big letters, and the other one, Israel's in big letters. They could be referring to the same place in some people's estimation, and other people's, no. So the reason I'm going to start with this is that's kind of where I started my work. I did my graduate studies in international conflict resolution, and I wound up in the West Bank and in Israel conducting interviews with people who had gone through the 1948 war, which is, at this point, obviously a lot older generation of people. They were younger at the time. So I collected oral histories from multiple generations of Israelis and Palestinians. The older generation who had either fled this conflict or participated in it as combatants, as Palestinians, and for the most part on the Israeli side, former elite commandos known as the Palmach. And asked them about their experiences of that war and how they had passed these stories down through multiple generations, interviewed their grandchildren to see how this had influenced their understanding of the conflict, the region, and the wider world. So that's kind of my introduction to doing media in the Middle East. I was working for a human rights organization. I was bored with a desk job, and I just bluffed my way into borrowing a camera and running around and interviewing people. So I went back to the US. I learned how to edit, taking night classes, and I put this really crappy film from an artistic standpoint in a couple of film festivals, and I won a small grant to do a similar project. Next. This time on the US-Mexico border. So in some ways I needed to travel all the way to the Middle East to deal with this divisive issue that was literally my backyard. I was living in New Mexico at the time, and I grew up in California, two states that are affected by this issue directly. So in traveling back and forth between the US and Mexico, we're looking like 2009, 2010 at this point, and also into 2011, I had a realization. I ran out of money to complete this film project. And I had chosen a topic that was huge, like immigration, human trafficking, the drug war, all of these issues that there's no way I could possibly accomplish on like a $10,000 budget over the course of a couple of years. So, did I lose my microphone? So I decided to change my focus. I went to a local newspaper and said, look, I've got an idea. I have access to communities in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, which at the time was the murder capital of the world, related to access points for narco traffickers trying to get into the U.S. It's a border city with El Paso, Texas, which incidentally was one of the safest big cities in the U.S. at the time. So right across the river from a place that was more or less getting closer to Baghdad at that time. And I said, look, I've got an idea. I want to use my access to Mexican families to give them an opportunity to tell their story, but in real time. Instead of having me as the mediator or myself as the editor of what's relevant and what's not, why don't we just have Americans and Mexicans sit down over dinner and talk to each other directly across this border using available technology, Skype, whatever. So I pitched this idea, they said yes, and I spent several months going back and forth, setting up Skype accounts in Mexican families' houses, and launched what became that thing that you saw in the beginning, the Virtual Dinner Guest Project. So around this time, we're into 2011, and the Arab Spring, for those that weren't following the news at all at that time, there were a few uprisings that took place across the Middle East and North Africa, beginning actually in late 2010 into 2011, and some are as yet to be resolved. Syria, for example. This was all going on, and I realized I need to get back to that part of the world with this idea, but I've got no money. My day job was as a social worker, and how can I pull this off? So I had developed a little bit of a following on social media. I'd done a few projects with Mexico, one with Pakistan, and one with Uganda, just from this little town in New Mexico. And with the following that I had generated, I said, look, I'm going to buy a one-way ticket to Beirut at the beginning of 2012, so a couple of months from this time. And I'm going to launch a crowdfunder when I get there. But I want you to know that I'm serious, so I'll take this first step first. And that's what I did. So February 2012, I took off for Beirut. I had a couch to sleep on for a couple of months and a budget to last about that long. And I set about doing these dinner events, these conversations between university students, young entrepreneurs, people with backgrounds much like yourselves in Lebanon, and also of Syrian origin. There were already quite a few refugees coming in at this point, and connecting them to American universities. Doing this totally for free, just to try and build up a following for this concept, thinking that it might lead to funding in the future. Raised some money through crowdfunding, went on to Egypt, onto Tunisia. At that point, Skype corporate found out about what I was doing. I talked them into giving me a little bit of money, not as much as you might think. And at that point, took that donation and snuck into Syria. This is September 2012. I went back to Syria with a friend of mine from Aleppo, and we did some of our programming from there over the course of about a week. And over the past few years, I've kind of not looked back. I've had some very slow periods, and it's definitely not been financially secure enterprise at all. I've never had a consistent source of funding. I've had my funding cut for political reasons. I've had my reputation attacked for political reasons. And it's been a struggle. I've been working in a difficult neighborhood to navigate politically if you want to maintain secure funding and also keep your soul. If you want to go next. So, what my project actually is. It started out with just making these connections literally over dinner. So we would just set up a mock-up of like this table, and in one country you'd have a screen much like this at the end of it, and we would exchange recipes. You'd eat what they eat in their country, and we'd have an open discussion about what's going on in your community. What do you want to tell us? What are our misperceptions? What are the stereotypes that you want to clarify? After about 2.5 years of doing that, I realized this is a total dead end. It's interesting. I was getting some media coverage, but it was producing basically zero results. And I wasn't really in this to just create a cash cow for an NGO. I really wanted to see something happen. So I stopped doing my programming after I was in Syria and saw that, okay, I've seen some things that really bothered me, and I wanted to make sure that if I was going to take other people's time, that I had something to give back, that could actually get in front of people, and that wasn't just an insular conversation. So what I've been doing ever since, up until this point, is integrating the idea of filmmaking into these events. So the way it works is pretty simple. I get 5 to 7 participants, typically from universities, civil society organizations, or cultural events, like, for example, film festivals and their staff and their supporters, in 2 different countries that share either a set of political or cultural conflicts, or they have solidarity in common. Like they're 2 countries that are maybe dealing with a similar set of challenges, Spain and Greece, or India and Brazil, right, dealing with some similar social and economic challenges. They agreed to sit down and have 2 90-minute discussions. But in between those 2 discussions, there's about 3 weeks to a month where they need to create a film together. So the way this first dinner works is pretty simple also. Before you come to the event, each side exchanges a news article from the mainstream press of their own country. So if we're doing Spain and the US, for example, we might choose something from El País in Spain, but the subject of that article would be something to do with the US. And the US would do the opposite, like the New York Times has something to do with Spain. And we come prepared to discuss how each of our communities are being taught to perceive of each other by the dominant media cultures in our respective communities. And we work together to deconstruct the difference between what we're being taught and what the other people are actually experiencing in their daily lives. It's about a 90-minute discussion. We eat whatever we're going to eat. And at the end of it, each side then has an opportunity to pose a final question to the other side. It can be anything you want, but generally it should be kind of incisive. It should be something that's going to provoke thought in the audience. So, for example, from a connection I did with Lebanon and, or I should say Gaza and the Netherlands for one of my last projects, the Dutch side asked Gaza, what is your chief dream in the world? What's the primary obstacle keeping you from achieving it? And how will you overcome it? So the teams on both sides then had 3 weeks to run around their communities with a film crew and a microphone and go up to random people on the streets and ask them this question to get an answer directly from the streets, what people thought. Film the B-roll for documentary filmmakers out there, like to get the atmospherics. People know what Gaza actually looks like. That's important too. And then we post them both online. They're shot in the local language and we subtitle them in English so that we don't bar anyone for participation because of the English language barrier. We post them online as a free public education resource so that they can get out in front of the global community. And then we reconvene for one final dinner. In this case, we closed the film festival with a live event. We connected the Dutch crew to the people in Gaza in front of an audience and had one final dinner with them. And during that dinner, the audience was able to actually speak to the filmmakers on both sides, live with Gaza and the people who had participated in Rotterdam. So in that sense, we were able to get it in front of a wider audience, in front of more artists, civil society organizations, locally, etc., and make it part of a festival. So the objective, or the levels of impact that I'm going for with my programming are always conceived of on 3 levels. Interpersonal. I want to develop an empathetic connection between everyday people. If you sit down and have dinner with somebody who you've more or less been acculturated to think of only in terms of extremism or terrorism, or just other in some way, and you see them eating and bouncing their kid on their knee and just being a human being, it has a very profound and immediate but subtle psychological effect. You realize, aha, like they do what I do. They eat, right? So that's the not rocket science part of the psychological manipulation involved in my project. The community level impact is, okay, it's a certain type of person that's going to do a project like this, right? Like, I'm more likely than not going to attract the extremes to participate in these projects. And that's a problem. If you really want to have a meaningful discussion about divisive political and social issues, you need to have what are called stakeholders. All people with a dog in the fight need to be present for that discussion. So how do you overcome that if what you end up with is more or less university students in 2 countries that are kind of on the liberal end of the spectrum agreeing that it's the right that's the problem? Well, for me, the idea was get them out on the streets and make sure that they're engaging with people who, as students, they might normally ignore, that they might dismiss as like uneducated or just different. The parts of their own community, their own culture that they're unfamiliar with. If you're taking the pains to reach out across the world and try and understand a different culture, but you don't take the time to understand your own, it's kind of a waste of time, right? And then on the final scale is global, and that's pretty straightforward. We try to push this stuff out through social media, to whoever our partners are. If it's a university, this could go on their websites. We try to encourage participation through social media and ask questions that are posed in the projects to the people who are observing what we're doing through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And of course, we invite the traditional press to cover what we're doing and then link to our videos. So the ultimate objective for what I'm doing is to remove myself from the center of the production. I've been involved in every single one of these, so at this point, counting just the dinner parts, about 80 of these connections between 20 countries at this point. It's exhausting and it's not scalable if I'm the one that needs to be involved in everything. So the idea is to start doing trainings of trainers, right? To use each one of these projects to create ambassadors for the concept and then send them out in their communities and recruit people to participate. To make this a mainstay part of university course curricula in the social sciences, in media, in regional studies, you name it. Pretty much every discipline in the humanities would be relevant. And then, at the end of the day, invite people to post whatever they create on our website. So we will be the aggregator of what's kind of this decentralized community of producers all over the world. People working locally, but in collaboration with other local communities, can then post this content on our website, where anybody who doesn't even know what our project is can come and then watch it by either geography, picking a country and seeing what they've talked about, or picking a topic. Women's rights, seeing which countries have talked about that issue through our project. So that's how I'm conceiving of the ultimate objective, something that kind of runs under its own power at some point. Next. That's it. So yeah, that's a screenshot of the website. I invite any questions if you want to know more about what I do. You can contact me and I can just send you a lot of the stuff that I've talked about in the form of a PDF with some helpful links. I was thinking that really a Q&A today would focus more on questions you might have about things I've seen in some places I've traveled in the Middle East, or I'll do my best to talk about what's happening right now. But really, it's up to you. That's it.
Oh, Eric, I would have a fantastic project. It's really worthwhile. I would be curious, how do you win people's trust? How do you get in touch with people and make sure that they trust you and they buy into the project?
It's a really good question, and I almost never get asked that actually. So it's really, yeah, it's a huge issue, of course,
Yes.
but it depends on what level of the project we're talking about. So as far as just getting people to sit down and have a conversation, that element of the project, that's by far the least challenging, because the commitment and the exposure, the risk is fairly low. People just can sit down and have a discussion. Maybe they're nervous about being monitored on Skype, but really there's not so much fear. But with some exceptions, right? If you're doing this in Syria and some other places, sure. The real issue where that comes in is with the street interviews. And more to do with the people you're talking to on the street. Because these aren't people that know about everything I just told you. We're in and out of their lives. We're in and out of their lives in like maybe 2 minutes, right? And in some places where media, Westerners are regarded with a lot of suspicion or open hostility. There is no one solid answer to that. But 2 ways I would address it. For example, getting into like refugee camps, Syrian refugee camps, in Lebanon, Palestinian camps. I follow the participants. So one of the strengths of this project is that it's of the communities that we're representing. Like the participants make it their own. So if I want to get into Sabra Shatila refugee camp, I'm following a Palestinian who lives there. They're just taking me down the street. If we get stopped by the security inside of the camps, they're the ones explaining, this is my neighborhood, you can't tell me I can't film here. So I need to win the trust of the person who's involved in the project, sure, but that's months in the making. I don't throw these aren't pop-up events that I do like on a weekly basis. It takes months of planning. What was I going to say? As far as the downsides that I've experienced, in the beginning, like when I first started spending a lot of time in Egypt, 2012, so roughly like a year after the uprisings in Tahrir Square, things were super open. People were excited to see foreigners for the most part, and wanted Western media to be covering what they were going through. And part of that was that they were hoping we would support, right? That our governments would maybe take a different tack. And as it became clear that that wasn't going to happen, and as there was a military coup that took place in Egypt in the summer of 2013, that changed radically. And at that point, it became a huge liability to be a foreigner doing any kind of media work, or really anybody with a camera. You were called Al Jazeera, which is an organization that was looked at with particular suspicion in Egypt. And as soon as I would hear that being whispered anywhere, I just knew it's time to go. We've been stopped, I think, the last 3-4 times we've done the project. 3 of those times I've been in Egypt doing it, 1 from abroad, by the police. And so I've stopped doing programming there, which is really unfortunate. I mean, to be honest, it's under those conditions when you should be doing it, right? It's exactly for that reason that you should be trying to promote transparency and really push the boundaries of free speech. But the problem is this: I'm not CNN, I'm not the BBC, I'm not Human Rights Watch. I don't have their resources. I don't have their megaphone, their soapbox. If somebody doing my project gets detained and they're an Egyptian, they're not going to get a slap on the wrist like I am and get sent home. And even that's an assumption for foreigners at this point, because some have been killed. But for Egyptians, goodbye, like 20 years in prison if you're ever seen again. So I don't have some place where I can make a call for appeals that's going to get them released. So for that reason, because I can't assure at least a certain level of certainty about making some noise, I've ceased doing programming there. But where I do focus a lot is in Gaza. It's pretty open to foreign press. They want people to see what they're going through, and they're stuck. So, I mean, they're not going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. And there's a lot of very talented people that are used to doing media because it's one of the most highly covered conflicts globally. So It really depends. The answer to that question really depends on where you are, and it's evolved over time.
How do you think you can promote sort of citizen journalism in this kind of way? Because it seems like most of these issues, in Gaza, Venezuela, also we're fed through the media, or the corporate media, as it were, the narratives which possibly have some separation from what you would get from something more like what you're doing direct citizen journalism.
So what's the question? Sorry.
How do you think you promote more sort of citizen journalism and getting to the sort of more human-to-human level for understanding of these?
That's what I'm doing. I mean, that is what the project is. It is citizen journalism. How to promote that? Sure. How to make it grow? I mean, that's something I'm still trying to figure out. That one. That's the bajillion-dollar grant question, right? But I mean, as far as the mechanisms, I think the tools that I would use to do that would be some of these institutions that I pointed to. If I can get universities all over the world integrating this into their pre-existing courses, as a way to actually connect immediately with these issues, not just in a distant way as like in the realm of theory, but where these are actual people you can speak to. The rest kind of just runs itself. Once that conversation is started and they follow these mechanisms, everything just kind of falls into place. You will hopefully be moved, having spoken to somebody in Iraq over the course of a month. You will have produced something that's outside the scope of like the traditional media narrative as someone who's just created it yourself. And the promotion of that is kind of up to the participants, to make it their own. The institutions that we work with, to work with us to get the word out. And yeah, I mean, I'm no threat to CNN's platform, but I think if you have enough institutions getting behind the concept and making it their own, that's a possibility for sure.
Yeah. How do you stay impartial? How do you stay impartial?
I'm not.
Oh, you're not?
No, not in the slightest. What I would say is this: in the context of my project, that's very important. So what I don't do is use this project as a platform for trying to convince people to think the way that I do. We're nonpartisan, non-sectarian, and I believe very strongly that we need to stay that way. And we're also inclusive, so to the point where I don't take money from the U.S. government because they would place restrictions on who I'm allowed to talk to, ironically. So I want to make room for just about all stakeholders with some extreme exceptions. Like I wouldn't use this to platform Islamic State, right? But I would talk to some groups that the U.S. wouldn't. So as far as impartiality, I'm not, and I think it's important to recognize that really none of us are, and to just be really honest with yourself about what your biases are. I know that there's certain subjects that if I'm given a platform to speak about them, I'm going to have an emotional connection to that issue because I've been in these communities, and it's going to be impossible for me to remain neutral. And I think when it comes to conflicts, especially armed conflicts where there's human lives in the balance, there's a point at which maintaining the pretense of neutrality actually becomes immoral. If you actually see that the burden of guilt or responsibility lies more on one group than the other, and you pretend that that's not the case, you're facilitating suffering. So in my own time, I make that clear. I would say I also choose the topics that I choose, right? So I might not be coming out and using my project as a way to say, look what Israel's doing, or agree with my view on Palestine, right? But I am highlighting Palestine in a lot of my work, right? I'm making sure that they have an opportunity to say what they need to say. I don't tell them what to say, and you don't see me in these videos. So that's kind of how I work to remove myself from the ideological element of the project. Incidentally, I'm planning to launch a podcast in the next couple of months because I've had it with not being able to talk. So.
How do you deal with multiple people wanting to cover the same countries or the same issues?
In the context of the project?
Yeah, so you're talking about having a website that would aggregate all this content, and if you have 50 videos on Palestine and Israel, how do you deal with that?
That's awesome. The more the better. I mean, my view on it is just because somebody's done a documentary on Sudan in 2016 I mean, someone can make a documentary a week later, talk to completely different people, ask different questions, and that film will resonate with a different audience in a different political moment. So, yeah, as far as oversaturating conflicts, that is an issue, like image fatigue, donor fatigue, these things do exist. But if the alternative is just saying, you know what, that's already been covered, let's just keep pushing the content that's already out there that's not working, I'm going to err on the side of let's just keep trying to find another way to access people.
Are the uploads curated in any way? Or are they curated in any way?
The content once we're done, or the conversations?
What's on the website?
I mean, curated in this, I'm not sure what you mean. Like, when they're done, we just post them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that sense, sure. Like, I just say, here's, like, the last 2 projects, if you go to the projects page on the website, they're right there. Like, they're in the banner. So just click and watch. And then there's a link to some testimonials from participants, so you can actually see how they feel about the project, having gone through it, because they're not on camera usually, they're behind it. And then all of our previous projects. So the thing that I'm really working on now is trying to scale this project and to improve our production value. For a long time, it was me running around as this self-taught amateurish filmmaker, and you're not going to reach, unfortunately, as wide an audience as you would like if your videos don't look good. So I'm working on being more patient, trying to get more funding so that we produce something that looks good, that more people are going to watch.
Last one? Yeah. I was just wondering, because I am from this region, from North Africa, Morocco. So I was wondering if the project has ever covered other than the Middle East. Because from my understanding, and if you go to Morocco, we don't feel like we are part of the Middle East. That's separate to us. It seems like, I think to everybody in the city group, it's very far. The information and the news we're getting from there is sometimes censored, sometimes it's not what's actually happening in the field. So I was just wondering, like, is the project only about what's going on in the Middle East, as in Palestine, or?
No. And I haven't done Morocco yet, and that's not because I don't want to, I just haven't had the opportunity. I'd love to. And point taken, I mean, is Morocco the Middle East, or isn't it? And I mean, some of that, Arabs will disagree on that point. Some will say Egyptians aren't real Arabs, you know? And I'm out of that conversation. I'm unaffiliated ethnically. But as far as where the reach is of the project, it's been 20 countries on 5 continents at this point. So it's been pretty broad. I'd say that a majority of that time has been focused on the Middle East, and that's partly just by design. That's my academic background. That's where, like, in my solo travels, I first caught wind of the fact that I wasn't being told the whole truth by my government or the media. And I had a chip on my shoulder about it and wanted to explore that more and take people on kind of the same journey that I'd been on myself. But as far as where it's been across Europe. My NGO is actually based in the Netherlands. And we've dealt with the refugee crisis. It's been in the Balkans. And it's connected some kind of unusual endpoints. Like, I think I've done Brazil and India. I've done Mongolia and Lebanon, Kosovo and Gaza. And then a lot with the U.S. Because as an American, I feel kind of a civic obligation to educate the American taxpayer about where their money is being spent.
So to that end, as an American, I'm interested in your experience of how we've been lied to.
That's a big, narrow it a little bit.
Okay, so one example of how we've been lied to, and I know there's probably thousands, but
Do you want me to just pick
one?
I mean, if you looked at Trump's Twitter feed this week, I mean, yeah. I'm trying to think of like an example that would illustrate a rule. Generally speaking, because I think if I just pick an isolated incident, that's problematic. But generally speaking, my aha moment was not so much like a black and white lie, it was just misrepresentation of like the Middle East is kind of being this monolithic entity filled with people that all think and act the same. It's decidedly not American. In fact, they spend most of their time burning our flag. And they have this religion that's bent on spreading a caliphate, all of that stuff. And the first time that I went to the Middle East was my first time traveling alone, years ago. And I really went not knowing what to expect. This was right after September 11th, about a year after. I went as an Arabic student in Egypt. And I believed like all the BS about like how unsafe the whole region was and how much Americans were hated and all of that stuff. And I quickly encountered on the street, just because I had to buy groceries and interact with everyday people in a broken Arabic and mostly in English, that they tended to know a lot more about the politics in my country than I knew about theirs or really any of the countries around them. This idea that people were just kind of hateful, uneducated, and only influenced by religion. Another one is that Islam is practiced in like this singular way. That everybody who's Muslim is like super duper Muslim, or not Muslim at all. And no, it's more or less approximates what I've experienced of Christianity in the US, that you have people that take their religion more or less seriously, go to church every week or don't, keep Ramadan, don't, drink beer, don't, or are dealing with cognitive dissonance, like where they feel guilty about the fact they're not practicing their religion in a strict way because their parents want them to, you know? So that would be maybe one of the biggest ones, is starting to realize, look, at the time, I was raised in a very strict Christian evangelical family, so a lot of my experience of growing a community of Muslim friends was like, this sounds familiar. And also my path toward becoming a little bit less militant in my religious views tracked, I think, with some of my Muslim friends as well.
What is your take on women traveling there alone?
There depends on where you mean.
Fair.
So I would say Lebanon is a different bag than Egypt. I don't know about Morocco. I've heard stories, but I could say that Egypt is pretty notorious. And also some of this depends on how well you blend in. So if you're a blonde, fair-complected Westerner, that factors in, as it does for men, to be honest, but in a different way. But Egypt is pretty brutal, even for an Egyptian woman, even if you're covered. So Lebanon, on the surface, you can go to a beach in Lebanon and the local women are wearing bikinis, but still the rates of sexual assault are pretty high from what I understand, and I think they just outlawed marital rape, right, to give you an idea of where they're at. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of this is contextual.